In the early morning of September 15, 1916, on the scarred fields of northern France, soldiers waiting in their trenches heard a sound they could not place. It was not artillery, not cavalry, and not infantry advancing. It was a deep, mechanical grinding, growing louder through the mist. Moments later, massive steel machines emerged from the smoke, moving slowly but relentlessly toward the German lines. For the men who witnessed this moment, warfare had crossed an irreversible threshold. What they saw that day would permanently alter the nature of modern war. By 1916, the First World War had reached a grim stalemate on the Western Front. Stretching from the north, sea to the Swiss border, opposing trench systems locked the armies of Britain, France, and Germany into a static and devastating struggle. Advances were measured in yards, paid for with tens of thousands of lives. Machine guns, rapid-fire artillery, barbed wire, and defensive fortifications gave the advantage to those who held their ground. The Battle of the Somme, launched in July 1916 by British and French forces, was intended to break this deadlock. Instead, it became one of the bloodiest campaigns in military history. On the first day alone, the British Army suffered nearly 60,000 casualties. Despite months of fighting, gains remained minimal. British military planners concluded that a new weapon was required, something capable of crossing trenches, crushing barbed wire, and surviving enemy fire while supporting advancing infantry. This requirement gave form to an idea that had been quietly developing since 1915 within the British Admiralty's Landships Committee. Influenced by industrial advances and the experience of naval warfare, engineers and officers sought to adapt armored, tracked vehicles for use on land. Their aim was not speed, but endurance and protection. By early 1916, prototypes were being tested under strict secrecy. The name chosen to disguise their true purpose during development was deliberately mundane. Tanks. The first operational tanks, known today as Mark I tanks, were crude and experimental machines. They weighed approximately 28 tons, moved at a maximum speed of about 4 miles per hour, and were prone to mechanical failure. Their armor could stop small arms fire, but not heavy artillery. Inside conditions were severe. Crews endured extreme heat, toxic fumes from engines and weapons, and constant mechanical noise. Communication was nearly impossible once the engine was running. Despite these limitations, British commanders believed the psychological and tactical impact of tanks could be decisive. A total of 49 tanks were allocated to support the British Fourth Army during an offensive near the village of Flers-Courcelette. As part of the wider Somme campaign, on September 15, 1916, the tanks were committed to battle for the first time. Mechanical unreliability immediately reduced their numbers. Many broke down before reaching the front. Others became stuck in shell holes or trenches. In the end, only about 32 tanks advanced toward the German lines, and fewer than half reached their intended objectives. Yet those that did advance produced an effect entirely disproportionate to their numbers. German soldiers encountering tanks for the first time were unprepared for armored vehicles that could cross trenches, flatten barbed wire, and continue moving under rifle and machine gun fire. Reports from German units describe confusion, shock, and in some cases panic. Standard infantry weapons proved largely ineffective. Only artillery fired at close range could reliably stop the machines. British infantry, long accustomed to advancing under devastating fire, found a measure of protection by moving behind the tanks. At Flers, one tank famously entered the village itself, contributing to its capture. For the first time since the beginning of trench warfare, a fortified position fell primarily due to mechanical force rather than mass infantry assault. Despite these localized successes, the broader offensive did not achieve a breakthrough. The tanks were too few, too unreliable, and deployed without sufficient tactical integration. Still, their presence marked a fundamental shift. For both sides, it was clear that a new category of weapon had entered the battlefield. German commanders rapidly analyzed the encounter. While recognizing the tank's current limitations, they understood their potential. Defensive measures were adapted, including the development of armor piercing, ammunition, and revised artillery tactics. At the same time, German engineers began work on their own armored vehicles, though production would lag behind that of the Allies. In Britain and France, lessons were drawn from the Somme experience. Tank design improved steadily. Engines became more powerful, armor more effective, and tactics more refined. By 1917 and 1918, tanks would be used in far greater numbers, most notably at the Battle of Cambrai and during the Allied offensives of the war's final months. The introduction of tanks in 1916 represented more than a technical innovation. It was a response to the industrialized slaughter that had defined the early years of the First World War. Tanks embodied an attempt to restore mobility to the battlefield and to reduce the catastrophic losses of frontal infantry assaults. Psychologically, their impact was immediate. Contemporary accounts from German soldiers emphasize fear, uncertainty, and the sense that existing defensive doctrines were no longer sufficient. Even when tanks failed mechanically, their presence altered behavior and decision-making at the front. Warfare was no longer confined to human endurance alone. It had become a contest of machines. Strategically, the tank forced all major military powers to rethink the relationship between infantry, artillery, and technology. Combined arms, warfare, coordinating different military branches into a unified system, began to take clearer shape. The experiences of 1916 influenced not only the remainder of the First World War, but also the doctrines that would dominate the conflicts of the 20th century. Economically and industrially, tanks symbolized the growing integration of civilian industry into warfare. Their production required steel, engines, fuel, and skilled labor on an unprecedented scale. This further blurred the line between frontline and home front, deepening the total nature of modern war. While the early tanks were imperfect, their conceptual legacy was profound. By the time the war ended in 1918, tanks had proven that heavily armored, mobile firepower could decide battles. In the decades that followed, this lesson would be refined and expanded, with consequences far beyond the fields of the Somme. The first tanks of 1916 were slow, unreliable, and often ineffective by later standards. Yet on that September morning, they represented a moment of transformation. The fear they inspired was not merely fear of a new weapon, but fear of an unknown future of warfare, one increasingly shaped by machines rather than men. As the First World War receded into history, the dramatic debut of tanks at the Somme was often overshadowed by larger battles and greater offensives. Yet its importance endures. In the grinding noise of steel tracks crossing shattered ground, the world witnessed the birth of modern armored warfare. What began as an experimental solution to a tactical problem became a defining feature of 20th century conflict. The men who first faced these machines could not know the full consequences of what they were seeing. But in that moment of shock and uncertainty, the character of war was permanently altered, leaving a legacy that continues to shape the modern battlefield.